Joel, after we read a couple of verses, would you like to comment on the agreements and disagreements between the synoptics in the scene of transfiguration? Because here's, on the one hand, of course, an example of Matthew and Luke drawing on Mark in their portraying the transfiguration. On the other hand, as you mentioned last time, as far as I remember, there are minor agreements between Matthew and Luke, which are important for our understanding of the history and prehistory of the synoptic gospels.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me try to think of something to say about that. But okay, provisionally, I'll say something.
Okay. Then let's first read some verses. Антон, вы готовы выступить нашим чтецом сегодня?
Да.
Давайте мы попросим вас прочесть стихи 2 и 3 из нашей главы.
Хорошо. Kai meta gemeras ex parombanei ho Iisus ton Petron kaiton Iacobon kaiton Ioannon kai anaferei autus eis oros hypslon kat idian monos kai metamorphothe emprosthen auton kai ta himatia autu egeneto stilbonta leuka bia Hoia grapheus epites ges udiunatai utos leukanei.
Да. Спустя 6 дней, взяв Петра, Иакова и Иоанна, Иисус приводит их на высокую гору, одних. Вот одних у нас пытался так передать. Конечно, очень важно здесь ключевое выражение, как идеан и монус. Да? Опять та же самая идея внутри текста Евангелия от Марка, что у нас есть какие-то разные концентрические круги, да? Есть внутренние ученики, но даже внутри внутренних учеников есть еще более внутренний круг, которые причастны тайнам. Но даже этот внутренний круг, он, как мы видим, как мы уже видели, постоянно не понимает происходящего. У них на глазах Иисус преобразился. Опять же, есть интересный вопрос. Вот в тот момент, когда эти тексты впервые писались или звучали по-гречески, у нас было ли уже у слова метаморфо какое-то техническое значение наподобие того, что сейчас у человека, знакомого с христианской традицией, возникает в сознании, тогда, когда речь идет про преображение, преобразиться и так далее. Или это действительно было еще слово никакого технического специального значения не имеющее, просто значение, скажем, изменил внешний вид. Да? Почему мне показалось осмысленным об этом задуматься, что у нас, собственно, про изменение чего-то в лице или фигуре, или образе Иисуса ничего не говорится, да? Говорится про то, как изменился вид его одежды, но ничего не говорится про то, как он сам изменился. Если глагол метаморфо еще не имел технического значения, просто сначала бы приобрел иной облик, то для первых слушателей или читателей этой истории возникал вопрос, в какую сторону он изменился, да? Для современного человека понятно, что преображение – это вот оно, сияние, фаворский свет и так далее. Здесь этого не сказано. Или уже вот, существовало какое-то представление, которое не отразилось в Марке, но отразилось в других Евангелиях, о том, что здесь преображение Иисуса, его метаморфозис, означало именно сияние божественное. Да? Но вот преобразился здесь не уточняется, то уточняется, что случилось с одеждой, его одежда сделалась ослепительно бела, стиль бонталепка, Лия, как не может выбелить на земле ни один белильщик. Ну вот, строго говоря, что касается именно выбора слов, наверное, не так уж много у нас возникает проблем, кроме тех, которые я говорил. А что касается вопроса о том, какие традиции стояли за этим нарративом, как они отражались в разных Евангелиях, это комментарий, который мы просили Джоэля нам что-нибудь сказать. We read the text in Greek and in Russian, and once again I mentioned both the problem that we have here with regard to the synoptic questions, the synoptic agreements and disagreements, and also I asked about the meaning of the verb metamorpho here. If it was not a technical term at that time, then it might have been not easily understandable for the readers and hearers of Mark, because Mark does not say what was the essence of this metamorphosis, differently from Matthew and Luke. If it was not a technical term, that it would have meant just he changed his external appearance. Which way? In what direction? Can we imply that already the hearers of Mark were acquainted with the fuller version that we have in Matthew and Luke?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure they would need that, because isn't metamorphothe explained to a certain extent by the next verse? You know, how was he changed? Well, he was changed because his clothes became shining, right? But the larger question is a good one. You know, does Mark and do his hearers know, you know, even before they read his gospel, do they know this story? And so I guess the primary evidence for that would be the agreement between Matthew and Luke, and I think there may be some other minor agreements, but the most important one is that in both Matthew and Luke, it's not only his clothes, but his face that shines. I guess on the screen. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. No, we have all the synoptics as well as John on the screen.
Okay. Yeah. And so, in Matthew, elam sen to prosoponautu hos ho helios. So his face shined like the sun. And in Luke, to eidos to prosopou autou heteron, or egeneto heteron. So the form of his face became different. So they both mentioned the face. I think that's the only exact word that is similar in Matthew and Luke that isn't in Mark, is a reference to his face. And I guess it seems to me that it's possible, at least, that both Matthew and Luke know that this is reflecting the story in Exodus about Moses coming down from the mountain and his face shining. And we know that was a famous story because it turns up, Paul mentions it in somewhere, 1st or 2nd Corinthians, about Moses's face.
That's Exodus 34, I believe, no?
Could be, yeah. Let's see.
I think that's 34, verse 35.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that mentions to prosopon too. And it's glorified. And therefore he puts a veil around his face because there's too much radiation coming out of his face. It's a new Chernobyl. So I think, that was a famous story, and I think if one doesn't want to posit, which I guess in general I'm reluctant, on these few occasions where Matthew and Luke agree with each other, I'm reluctant to say that means they knew an earlier version which Mark also knew and which he is editing. That just seems to me speculative. And whereas I don't think it is so unlikely that, sometimes Matthew and Luke independently editing their version of Mark are going to come up with the same change. And especially when there's a well-known biblical story that Mark's story would remind them of. So, but I think I mentioned last time, I wrote a long article, which I never tried to publish because I decided I couldn't prove it, in which I hypothesized this other theory that, Mark did have this other version in which Jesus' face shone, and he deliberately changed it because he wanted to lessen the similarity to Moses. I think that's an intriguing idea, but
It's a pity that you haven't published this, but now you have an audience where you can develop this idea.
Yeah, I know you like the idea. I finally decided it was too speculative, so and also in general, I guess, if you're going to say every time that there's a similarity between Matthew and Luke, there's a previous source which Mark is editing, then I think you get into all sorts of difficulties, and it's just too speculative. And I know, early on I became skeptical of that approach because there was a guy who wrote a book about the parables in Mark 4, in which also there are some similarities between Matthew and Luke over against Mark. And he said every time that, well, this was Mark's source, and so we can see Mark editing this previous source. And it just, I became convinced by his book that he was wrong, or that it couldn't be proved. Jan Lambrecht, a Belgium guy, had a book about the parables where that was what he argued. I mean, so, but it is interesting. Oh yeah. So I do think it's interesting that I think both another similarity is in verse 3 of Matthew and verse 30 of Luke, when they mention Moses and Elijah, they have them in that order. Moses first, Elijah second. Whereas Mark has Elijah first and Moses second. And the logical order is the one that Matthew and Luke give. Moses is first. Moses is the most important guy, I would argue, in the Old Testament. He should go first. And so I think it is strange for Mark to put them in the order of Elijah and Moses. And that, now it's coming back to me, that was also part of my argument in this long article, which I threw away.
Я просил бы Дмитрия выключить звук. Спасибо. Usually, я вижу, Жрец Царевич, что вы подняли руку. Я вам потом дам слово. Спасибо. Usually, we do not compare Mark with other synoptics while reading Mark. Maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong, but at least until now, this has been our practice. Maybe it was wrong, and we need from now on to look closer at the synoptical parallels. But at least in this case, because of all the questions that were raised, I would suggest that we should compare the synoptics word for word, starting with Mark, because it's clear that the synoptics, that Matthew and Luke were drawing on Mark, even if they had independent sources. Καμετά χαμέρας hex, παραλαμβάνε έχω Ιησούς τον Πέτρον, καί τον Ιάκωβον, καί τον Ιωάννην. Καμέτ χαμέρας hex, παραλαμβάνε έχω Ιησούς τον Πέτρον, καί Ιάκωβον, καί Ιωάννην. Τον δελφόν αутού. This is text of Matthew is almost identical with Mark. Again to the metatus logus tutus pasei hemerei octo, kai paralabon Petron, kai Ioannan, kai Iacobon. As usual, Luke, even when he draws on Mark, he changes the wording. Maybe partly to comply more with the rules of the Greek narrative, but we also have here a significant difference. Metahemeras hex or merhemeras hex in Matthew and Mark, but I would say hemerei octo in Luke. How can we understand this?
Yeah, I think I've seen some speculation about, like, okay, so the world was created in seventh day, but this is the eighth day, so it's sort of symbolic of, well, I think all the gospel writers recognize that this points forward to the resurrection. So that could perhaps go with the resurrectional context. It's also interesting that Luke adds, and you may want to come back to the eighth day, but he also adds proseuxastai. Jesus goes up there to pray. And that is something that Luke adds in other places to Markan's stories. He likes to portray Jesus as a man of prayer.
Okay, I think that both 6 days, Medhemeras hex, and 8 days in Luke, they're both somehow related to the understanding of the history of the world, as somehow related to the days of creation. I think we spoke that after 6 days may mean on the seventh day, which refers back to Genesis 1. But for say hemerei octo, this is a really strange thing in with regard to the calendar question. It was very characteristic of church fathers to describe the future aeon as the eighth day. But I think that for them, this was already influenced by a certain earlier theological reasoning that Jesus was raised from the dead on the first day after Sabbath, which is the eighth day, and the history of the world is symbolically correspondent to the 6 days of creation story plus the Sabbath, while the resurrection, that's the new world, the eighth day. So from this point of view, if we take all these commentaries of the Byzantine church fathers into account, the hemerei octo in Luke are quite comprehensible. They're even more, from this particular point of view, they're even more in place than hemerei hex of Mark and Matthew. But can we assume that already by the time Luke was writing, this typology and the idea of resurrection and the life for the future aeon is the eighth day was already so developed as it was in the Byzantine theology?
Well, so, I mean, this is the problem that we run into so often. The clear attestations are later, but you have something in Luke that's puzzling. He's made a deliberate change, and the later Byzantine theology of the eighth day as the day of resurrection and the beginning of a new world helps explain that. So I think you can use those later evidences to suggest at least a plausible hypothesis about why Luke has changed. I think it's not only the fathers, but also in some Gnostic texts, the Ogdoad, there's a mysticism about the number 8. And I think it probably comes from, the Jewish mysticism about the number 7 and then adding 1, to trump that.
Okay.
So, yeah, I would say one has to be cautious, but it's as good an explanation as any, I think. Because, 8, as far as I know, in the Old Testament, it's not particularly significant number. So how else are you going to explain it?
So Luke is somehow more advanced if we speak in terms of the development of the Christian doctrine and Christian theology than Matthew and Mark.
Yeah, or he might be the point of departure for that theology.
Yes, but behind this theology is a very practical thing that for the Jews, Sabbath is the holy day when every work is not allowed and so on and so on. At some point in the Christian church, this holy day of the week was moved from Sabbath to the resurrection day.
Yeah, and we do know that there were debates about this in the 2nd century, and that there were people both in Asia Minor and in Syria who continued to worship on Sabbath rather than Sunday, and it's also connected with the debate about when Easter should be celebrated.
Yeah,
So yeah,
so
I think maybe Luke does point the way.
yes, so Luke may be interpreted as a witness to the fact that somehow the very structure of the week was beginning to change in the Christian community in the direction of the later Christian interpretation of
Yeah, and these calendrical things, I think they're significant in discussing, parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity.
Yep.
Because once the holy day shifts, that's a profound shift. And you can see how important the calendar was for Jews by the disputes between the Qumran group and other Jewish groups about the Day of Atonement. What is the Day of Atonement and stuff like that. So calendar wasn't. Well, I think that's also been true in the history of Christianity. Calendar is not negligible. It's not unimportant in like defining identity.
yes, we see it already in the story of the flood, though we cannot understand the precise meaning of the calendrical indications there, but it seems that something stands behind them.
And my impression is that the Old Testament reflects both a lunar calendar and a solar calendar, but that by the time of Rabbinic Judaism, they've definitely opted for the lunar calendar. But the Qumran group had a solar calendar.
Yes.
But they're both biblical. Both of those ways of counting are biblical, but they became a real point of tension and even division.
Yes. Okay, let's read further. We saw that Luke has a significant and very interesting theological departure with regard to how many days were there between the earlier narrative and the transfiguration. Kai anafere autus eis oros hypsilon kat idian monus. This is reproduced almost word for word in Matthew. Kai anafere autus eis oros hypsilon kat idian. Probably the fact that Matthew dropped monus is not completely accidental. We saw that for Mark, it was very important that we have a system of concentric circles of Jews' disciples, inner circle of disciples, outsiders, and this topic of secret. Maybe the fact, definitely for Matthew, it was not so important. Maybe he dropped this monus because this was not as important for him, for his theology, as for theology of Mark.
Yeah, I mean, it's unnecessary. It's repetitious because katidian already means by themselves. And I think this is the only time where Mark has the double expression katidian monus. Like in 4:12, he has kata monus, and other times he has katidian. I think it is important that these three are the same ones. Peter, James, and John are the same ones who he took with him when he raised the dead girl to life. In chapter 5, I think it is. And so, that also suggests maybe a resurrectional background to the transfiguration story in Mark.
Yes. But in any case, this repetition katidian monus in Mark probably means that it was especially important for him at this point to double stress the very close circle of those who witnessed the resurrection.
Well, yeah, and at the end, as they're coming down from the mountain, he's going to tell them, don't tell anybody until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. Right? Another connection between the transfiguration and the resurrection.
Yes. Does this mean that even the remaining 9 disciples should know nothing about transfiguration?
I guess so. Never thought of it before. I'm not sure if Mark thought of it. I think, sometimes these injunctions to secrecy are a way of emphasizing how important it is, what's just happened. It's so important that it has to be a secret. But I think it's also in this case, and especially, in 9:9, I think it is, he tells them not to tell anybody until he's been raised from the dead. That's a very important verse for understanding the messianic secret as a whole. And I think, it's pointing to the resurrection as the point where, a new era begins. And again, I'd relate the transfiguration to the resurrection. And I noted last time that some people like Bultmann even think that this is a retrojected resurrection appearance that's been retrojected into the life of Jesus and the disciples.
Okay. As concerns Luke, in parallel place, we would not have any remains for the messianic secret. Aneb eisto oros prasevsce. On the one hand, the references that this was very close, the closest circle of disciples. There's no necessity to stress this, but Luke stresses that he was there to pray. Kai metamorphote emprosten auton. Kai metamorphote emprosten auton, kai elamsen to prosobon autu was ho helios. By the way, do you see the synoptic parallels on the screen? Yes?
Prekrasno.
Yes. That's the difference between Mark and Matthew that we started with.
And in the Exodus 34, didn't we see elam sen to prosopon?
Wait a second.
Same verb.
Doxazo is there.
Yeah. But elamsen wasn't there also? No, you're right. Okay.
Let's check, maybe.
I'm going to use my non-digital way of checking. Where is it?
You still live in pre-digital era.
Yes, we're not as advanced as you over here. Lampain. No, it doesn't occur in Exodus. Oh, Lampas occurs in Exodus 20. That's interesting. I mean, it is kind of interesting in Exodus 20, which is sort of parallel. You know, Moses also goes up there. 2018, there are lampadas.
Mhm.
And this is an interesting verse, and I think the rabbis pick up on this. V'kol ha'am ro'im et kolot. And the rabbis ask, you know, how could they see the voices? And they, you know, they have all sorts of mystical explanations. And v'et ha'lapidim. So on the first, I mean, there are parallels between these two ascents of Sinai, aren't there? Exodus 20 and Exodus 34. That lots of people think they're variant accounts of, they're doublets. But it's not a strong connection.
Yes. Of course, the image of shining is there in the Old Testament texts. That's Baruch.
And, you know, I'd say in general, this whole story of Moses going up there and getting the commandments and, you know, the things that happen, the celestial things that happen while he's up there. I mean, you can see in rabbinic literature, they were fascinated by this, and it became so central, among other reasons, because they said this is where Israel agreed to take the Torah upon themselves. And they even developed these stories about how it was offered to other nations and they refused, but Israel accepted it. It was just, you know, a central moment. So the idea that, you know, even before Christianity, Jews were thinking about this ascent of Sinai, going up, Moses becoming almost divinized, and that was already something that people were fascinated by.
Yeah, so there's definitely a reference to Exodus. (34), but not verbal.
Yeah. Well, except the reference to the prosopon, right?
Yes, but Elamson is not there.
Right.
Book of Exodus. Okay, so Matthew added Elamson to prosopon out to Hosech or Helios, which may be seen as a reference to the Exodus story, though there we do not have a comparison between Moses' face and Helios.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we have in Luke? Okay, again to entoprochesis prosepchestai auton. Once again, this stress on Jesus' prayer. To eidos to prosup out to a heteron.
I think that's probably Luke's interpretation of metamorphothe, don't you? You know, how was he different? How was his form different? Well, the appearance of his face was different. And it's almost like a paraphrase of metamorphothe.
Yes, but once again, this on the level of literal agreements, the agreement between Luke and Matthew is not minor. It's very minor, very slight. But still, the idea that his face shines is there, and probably the background is the same, namely the reference back to the Exodus story.
Well, yes, I agree with that. I mean, it doesn't literally say that his face shines in Luke, right? It just says that the appearance of his face became different. But I agree that that's probably the implication, that his face was shining.
Yeah, but in fact, in Exodus, the situation is also more complicated. What do we have in Exodus 34:29? Do we see the text of Exodus now on the screen?
Duh.
No. Because in Hebrew we have a very difficult expression, ki karan or panav,
Right.
which was the starting point for the medieval iconography of the horned Moses.
The horns, yeah.
Yes.
Doesn't that occur also later in the story, that that same root?
I do not.
Maybe not. Yeah, okay. Maybe I'm
It's-
wrong.
Here in this story,
Yeah, okay. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe this is yeah.
it occurs three times in this story.
Oh, okay.
But no.
Yeah.
But nowhere else except this story.
Yeah.
So in Exodus, είδε ότι the doxa στέχα όψεις το χρώματος του προσώπου how to. In fact, I think that the only thing a reader of this text can make after this text is that something happened to his face, because of what is implied by the doxastai όψεις του χρώματος του προσώπου is not so easily understandable.
Yeah, except, I mean, doxa is related to kavod Adonai, and that's like, there's something physically appearing about, the glory of the Lord. But it is interesting that the language is, again, restrained, maybe partly because they didn't know what to make of Quran.
And what is the physical meaning of the doxastai? If Matthew was drawing on this text of Exodus, then probably he understood that the doxastai is to be related with God's doxa, and God's doxa in the Old Testament may somehow imply shining.
Yeah, I think so.
But this is shining is not directly implied in the Exodus story. So probably you can say that Luke is closer, more cautious in retelling Exodus than Matthew is.
Cautious old Luke.
Yes. And then as regards his clothes, kai ta himatia autu agenta stilbonta leuka lian. Kada himatia autu agenta leuka hostofos. Once again, in Matthew, the shining is more evident. It's not, they're not just white. They're shining hostofos. In Luke, hohimitismos auto leukos exastrapton.
Yeah, lightning like it's white as lightning.
Yes, not the same image as in Matthew, but definitely both in Matthew and in Luke. We have the description more stressed, more connected with celestial phenomena than in Mark, whether with sun as in Matthew or with the lightning as in Luke. Not just white. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then the main question that was, in fact, the reason for us to compare three synoptic gospels at that point, what can they say us, what can this tell us about the history and prehistory of the gospel tradition, especially with regard to the suggestion that the image of transfiguration was the creation of the early church by moving the resurrection appearance of Jesus back into the time of his life. Was it Mark or his predecessors, or some common source for Mark, Matthew, and Luke made this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the plausibility that something that happens in Jesus' ministry can be a transplanted resurrection appearance, I think, is increased by the fact that in John chapter 21, you have the story of the great catch of fish. And in Luke, maybe chapter 5 or something like that, that story is situated in, or a very similar story is situated in the ministry of Jesus. So, that's evidence that stories can move one way or the other, either from a resurrection appearance to an event in Jesus' ministry, or the other way around.
Do we know of any examples of the reverse movement?
Well, it could be the reverse, and people argue this. They argue about whether it's John who has transplanted it to the resurrection rather than Luke who has transplanted it to the ministry. I mean, we don't know. But I think there are some arguments that in the past convinced me that it was from the resurrection back into the ministry. I can't remember exactly one of them is that in Luke, Peter says, "I am a sinful man." And that would make sense in the post-resurrectional context. But arguments, people argue it either way.
Okay.
One other interesting thing about, I mentioned before, these two men, and in Luke, verse 30, Caidu Andres duo, two men were conversing with him, and then he says, who were Moses and Elijah. But some people have argued that in the, quote, original version of this story, it was just two men, and that later in the development of the story, they became Moses and Elijah. I don't think that's a particularly strong argument, but it comes into discussions of the development of this story. But I do think it's interesting that in Mark's version, both, he takes out the he doesn't have the reference to the face shining, and he puts Moses after Elijah. So I guess, and this is what I wanted to argue in the article that I threw out. You could say that he was demoting Moses from perhaps a previous form of the story, which we can see, glinting through in the stories from Matthew and Luke, which have a more developed Mosaic typology.
But your idea was not that Matthew and Luke developed Mosaic typology more than Mark. Your idea was that it was Mark who demoted the Mosaic typology from the tradition he received.
That was my idea in the article I threw out.
Yeah, very interesting. Of course, with regard to Mark, one can explain the special emphasis on Elijah by the fact that Elijah is very important for Markan narrative. Elijah as altar, as another image for John the Baptist, and
yeah, and I guess I wanted to say Elijah is more clearly an eschatological figure than Moses, and that Mark's concentration is not on protology, but on eschatology.
one other thing that comes to mind when we discuss the Old Testament background of these passages is that Transfiguration, the Mount of Transfiguration, is clearly somehow related to the Mount Zion. And of course, especially mention of Moses.
To Mount Sinai, you're saying? No.
To Mount Sinai, yes, sorry.
Right.
Yes. Usually, when we speak about the Old Testament typology in the New Testament and the typology of Sinai, people speak about the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. But can we say that in this text, in this tradition, the tradition of Transfiguration, it was the Mount of Transfiguration which should be related typologically to Mount Sinai, and then when probably it was already in the Gospel of Matthew, or in his source, probably in Matthew, when Matthew compiled the Sermon on the Mount from different sources about Jesus, he created the second Sinai within his narrative.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. And in Luke, it's not a sermon on the mountain, it's a sermon in a field. And Matthew has the Sermon on the Mountain, then he has in the middle of the Gospel the Transfiguration on a mountain, and then at the end Jesus appears on a mountain, the resurrected Jesus in Matthew 28. And some people have argued that Matthew's book is arranged in five books. You know, there are 5 instances of this formula when Jesus had finished these sayings. So I think it's still a pretty good argument, you know, that Matthew has even arranged his gospel as a new Torah, and his Jesus is more clearly than in Mark, he's a new Moses. And as a matter of fact, my friend Dale Ellison has written a very good book called The New Moses about Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And he goes into the whole history of tradition, and it's a very, I think it's a wonderful book full of interesting things.
Okay. So in creating the Sermon on the Mountain and this new typology, Matthew doubled the Sinai typology. One was the inherited one in the Transfiguration, and the other was created by him.
Yeah, well, two others, I think, you know, the you know, making the sermon a sermon on a mountain, and then making the final resurrection appearance an appearance on a mountain, which doesn't happen in any of the other resurrection appearances in the Gospels. So he has this mountain thing, and I think it is related to his strong emphasis on Jesus as new Moses, which I think Mark shares to a certain extent. I mean, you know, we've talked about the feeding miracles. They have, you know, various Mosaic allusions, including even something like Mark mentions the first miracle happens, they sit on the green grass. You know, why is the grass mentioned? I think it also comes up in the Moses feeding miracles.
From the Moses?
In the Moses feeding miracles, I think. Hold on a second. Let me check on that. On the green grass. Oh, go on, and I'll come back to this when I get it. Recline on the green. No, okay. I guess I make this connection in my commentary, but it's just because it's not a literary connection with the Exodus story, but it's the fact that Passover is a spring festival, which is the only time that you see grass in the land of Israel.
Okay, let's return to our text. явились им Моисей и Илия, которые беседовали с Иисусом. We've already spoken about the symbolism of Elijah and Moses. As the images of a prophet and the lawgiver.
A prophet and what?
The lawgiver.
The lawgiver, yeah. I mean, Moses is also a prophet, right? And some people also want to relate this in Revelation. There's two men in Revelation 12.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they're identified.
Okay. Отец Ириней, я не забыл, я помню, что у вас был вопрос. Вам слово.
Thank you. There is an addition to the discussion of the sources of the gospel. Father Leonid Grilichis wrote a book, Archaeology of the Text, in which he claims that in the passages where Mark's stories are longer, we should search his interpretation of pre-Matthew's version or first version of Matthew Gospel. So sometimes Mark behaves himself like a metarguman who interprets shortened Hebrew story to the Aramaic-speaking community, or maybe even in Aramaic language. So that is the idea. Father Leonid today lives in Belgium. So we were mentioning a scholar from Belgium who thinks that sometimes the Gospel of Mark shows longer stories with the commentaries to Matthew and Luke. So that was my addition to this discussion. Thank you.
I think it's generally the case that at least Matthew shortens the Markan stories that he includes, which he includes almost all of them, and he generally, not so much in this example, but like maybe especially in miracle stories, he tends to compress them into just the most essential elements. But can you talk about this theory a little bit more? So Mark is functioning as a kind of midrashic
Yes, exactly.
commentator. Yeah.
So there are two directions of understandings of our understanding of the longer and shorter versions of the gospel. So Father Leonid's idea is that in many cases, Gospel of Mark, it's an interpretation, and these additions were made because there was an oral sermon provided by St. Peter, and from the words of St. Peter, Mark produced his Greek version of the Gospel. So number one was the oral sermon of Peter in Aramaic, and Peter himself relies on shortened version of Hebrew text, which further grew up in the Jerusalem community. And what we have nowadays, not Matthew, but Matthew 2, longer version with many additions provided by the Jerusalem community, not by Matthew himself, but by the community. So there is a little bit complicated idea, but he shows many examples.
Yeah, I mean that, you
I
know,
know the book
it could,
of Father Leonid, and I know Father Leonid, and he's a very wonderful and brilliant man who is very dear to me. But for I always told him that there are some moments in his book that I do not agree with. But it's very interesting book. He starts with comparing some texts from Mark and Matthew, where they're parallel, and showing, and at this point, I think it was a very persuasive demonstration, showing that from the point of view of syntax, lexics, and so on, the Markan parallel is looking more like a Greek text based on Aramaic version, while the text of Matthew looks more like based on the Hebrew text and Hebrew version. To my mind, there's another explanation. I think that the passages that he compared and the comparison he made are very interesting, but to my mind, this should rather be explained by the fact that Matthew was at some places more heavily influenced by the Greek language and the imagery of the Septuagint, which was more marked with the influence of the biblical Hebrew. So that in Mark, we can see some reflexes of the Aramaic form of the Christian tradition. And when Matthew makes these passages conform to the conform to the language of the Septuagint, to the Greek language of the early Christianity, this gives an impression of being closer to the Hebrew language and Hebrew idioms which were behind this Greek language of the early church or the Septuagint. This is my comment on what Father Rene said.
and do either of you remember examples of where does he see the Aramaic influence here in the Transfiguration story?
No, we're not speaking about Transfiguration story. At least
Okay, right.
there are some other passages where Father Leonid looks at parallels between Matthew and Mark, and points out that some syntactical and lexical discrepancies between Mark and Matthew can be explained by Mark being closer to Aramaic tradition, while Matthew being closer to the Hebrew tradition. At this point, I always was always saying to Father Leonid that I would rather explain these passages as reflecting some more influence from the Greek language of the Septuagint and the early church, which was more influenced by Hebrew idioms and Hebrew syntax. If you want, I can share with you some of these parallels that you looked at.
I'd like to see that. Yeah.
They're really very, very interesting. I do not know if someone looked at the parallels between Matthew and Mark from this perspective, but that's
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, you know, Matthew Black wrote this whole book on Aramaic in the Gospels, and then Morris Casey yeah, also wrote on the Aramaic of Mark. And I think part of the problem is there's so few people who can evaluate these arguments that, at least with Casey, I thought he got away with things that he shouldn't have gotten away with. I like the book by Matthew Black a lot more. But I think, you know, it is sometimes difficult to, you know, identify something as an Aramaism as opposed to a Hebraism. But I'd like to see what Father Leonid. Yeah, I'd like to see some of these examples.
okay. By the way, since you know Russian,
Yeah.
I can just send you his book in Russian.
Okay.
And
All right.
if you have any question with regard to Russian, I would be happy
Okay.
to be your matraguman.
And is he still among the living?
Yes, yes. He's now in Brussels,
Yeah.
and
What is his Leonid is his first name, and his surname is what?
Griliches.
Okay.
Griliches.
Okay, well, you'll send me his book, so
Okay, agreed.
I'll have a full report next week. After I finish Voina Emir.
What do you have next week?
I'll give you a full report next week after I finish Voina Emir.
Okay, and you're going to finish Voina Emir in 1 week.
Yeah, I've already started it, so.
Oh, you already started reading Voina Emir in Russian.
I do sometimes look at it, yeah.
Okay, you can do it in parallel, reading Voina Emir and some biblical literature in Russian.
Yeah, they'll help each other, yeah. I
Okay,
think Larissa wanted to say something, right?
yes, Larissa?
I'd like to ask if we can speak about minor agreement between Matthew and Luke here. Since we have the agreement only in general picture, but the vocabulary differs. And since minor agreements refer to dependency at the level of written texts, then possibly we have other type of the dependency here. What do you think?
I mean, I guess I think prosopon, that is a vocabulary agreement that Matthew.
But verbs are different.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I guess this is part of the reason that I'm, you know, a little bit reluctant to posit a different source, you know, because it doesn't seem to me that the agreements are, as you say, it's only like in the case of prosopon, one word. You have the reversal of Moses and Elijah. You don't have like two words in a row where there's an agreement. So I don't think it's a particularly impressive, you know, in terms of positing like a different underlying source. And I guess that's why, again, why I withdrew from, you know, this project of trying to reconstruct the previous source that then Mark has edited. So I agree that But I think sometimes people do talk about minor agreements when it's only a matter of a single word. But I don't make as much of the minor agreements as, those who want to say that it's a very significant. I don't think generally they are so significant, and I think they can usually be explained as Matthew and Luke independently, editing Mark in similar ways, which is bound to happen sometimes. I mean, when you think of all the thousands of words there are in these Gospels and the way that Matthew and Luke have, they haven't slavishly followed Mark. They have felt free to restate the things that Mark has said in their own words. Sometimes they're going to come up with the same solution. So I guess that's what I want to say about that.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you.
And and it's different from the situation with the major agreements that are the basis for the Q hypothesis. Where you have like whole stories that are, or like the expansion of the temptation narrative. Obviously, they both are telling the same story. That seems to me different from the situation with things like prosopon appearing in both Matthew and Luke here.
Mhm.
Я думаю, что нашу следующую встречу мы начнем уже с 5 стиха, но для того, чтобы нам начать нашу встречу с 5 стиха, мы должны, как сейчас принято говорить, закрыть гештальт и 4 стих прочесть по-гречески и по-русски, а также спросить, есть ли остались еще какие-то вопросы по отношению к стихам 2, 3 и 4, о которых мы сегодня говорили. Антон, можно спросить, прочесть 4 стих, чтобы наша традиция была выдержана?
Хорошо. Kai ofthe autois Elias sun Moisei, kai esan sulauntes to Ису.
Явились им Моисей и Илья, которые беседовали с Иисусом. Вот про порядок следования. Мы уже говорили, да, кстати, прошу прощения. И здесь это, вероятно, на меня повлиял порядок следования Иоанна Матфея, конечно же. Прощаю. Моисей, которые беседовали с Иисусом. Хорошо. У нас по стихам 2, 3 и 4, вот по этой замечательной истории, есть еще какие-то вопросы?
We should come back to Chitira next time, though, because it's interesting that Mark doesn't tell you. He says that they were talking with Jesus. He doesn't tell you what they were talking about, right? Luke fills that in. Luke tells you they were talking about Jesus' Exodus.
Yes.
So, yeah, if we could come back to that next time, just briefly, I think that would be interesting to make a synoptic comparison again.
Yes, by the way, probably since our reading is already a very slow reading, maybe we can make synoptic comparison at least at some places also a part of our reading, because sometimes it's really very important for the tradition to see what other synoptic writers have.
Yeah, I generally didn't do that in my commentary, but sometimes I did, just because it was interesting. So I agree. And
Yes.
is Orthodox Easter this Sunday or?
No, the next Sunday.
Oh, okay. So,
We have Monday, Thursday next time.
all right.
Yes. This Sunday, that's Palm Sunday, I think. That's the correct
Palm
name.
Sunday. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Anyway, we're in it like an Easter type narrative, I think, and we'll probably still be there. Yeah, we'll still be there next Thursday. So
Yes, definitely. So the ecclesiastical calendar somehow runs parallel to our calendar of Markan reading.
and some people say there is no providence.
Okay, we can see that the story of our seminar is a counterexample.
I agree.
Окей. Отец Ириней, можно будет с вами поговорить потом еще позже, но не по Zoom, а просто я вам позвоню?
Да. В котором часу? Через сколько?
Ну, через полчасика, хорошо?
Отлично, все, в 20:00 по-вашему.
Хорошо. Окей.
Спасибо.
Спасибо всем, кто с нами был. Thank you, Joel,
Yeah.
for being with us. I have a question to you
Yes.
on a more personal level.
Okay.
I promised to send you my paper on Raphael, on the angel Raphael, but now I'm working a bit on this paper, so I can send it to you later. But if you still have time to read papers by your read not only Russian monographs, but also English papers by your Russian colleagues, I can send you a short paper on the translation of Hebrew verbs in the Septuagint Psalms. I know that
I always have time to read your papers, so I can set aside Voina Emir.
Okay.
For a few minutes, yeah.
Okay. Then, if you like reading papers on the Septuagint, I'll send this to you maybe today.
Okay. Thank you. I look
Thank you.
forward to that. Okay. Thank you for it's a really interesting discussion.
Thank
Yes,
you very much.
the discussion, yes, was interesting. I remember a book which I read some time ago, which was devoted to the English translation and commentary of the Assyrian inscriptions of Ashurbanipal. And this book started with what is the correct English term when you devote a book to someone, for example, to your friend or to your wife?
Dedication.
Dedication. Yes. Yes. This was the most brilliant dedication that I have ever read. It was dedicated to the king Ashurbanipal, who made all the preparatory work for this PhD dissertation.
That's good. I like that. Well, my friend Allison dedicated one of his books to me, and I really liked the dedication. He cited this rabbinic text from a vote where 2 or 3 are gathered together and words of Torah pass between them. You know, the divine spirit is there. I really liked that.
Okay.
Okay, well, but
Okay. We'll see each other next Thursday.
Okay, good. There's not a liturgical problem for you to meet next Thursday?
It may be a liturgical problem, by the way.
Well, I mean, I can watch for it seemed to me that it might have been a problem for Larissa, but
Yes. I'll check with our colleagues and then I'll make a letter. Okay.
Okay,
Great.
fine. Okay. All right, до свидания.
So see you next Thursday or
Or in Shavuayim.
yes.
Okay.
In 2
Cheerio.
weeks.